Today's story will leave you breathless. It's about Bear, a retired police dog whose instincts exposed one of the most shocking conspiracies in modern healthcare history. This is a story about corruption, cover-ups, and the unwavering loyalty of a four-legged hero who refused to stay silent when human lives were at stake. Picture the perfect retirement home. Rose Hill sits on manicured grounds in Northern California, with white rocking chairs lining wraparound porches where elderly residents sip sweet tea and watch hummingbirds dance around feeders. The staff moves with practiced grace, their voices soft and hands gentle. Families drive hours to visit, calling the place a blessing. Patients describe it as peaceful. But peace, as we'll discover, can be the most dangerous illusion of all. Bear wasn't just any therapy dog wandering these pristine halls. This German shepherd had served 6 years with the police force, completing over 50 successful drug busts and earning multiple commendations for bravery. He'd tracked dangerous suspects through dense forests, detected explosives at crime scenes, and saved more lives than anyone could count. Now, at 8 years old, with silver threading through his dark fur and a slight stiffness in his hips from years of dedicated service, Bear had supposedly earned his peaceful retirement at Rose Hill. He spent his days bringing comfort to elderly residents, his calm presence a soothing force in a place where every sunrise might be someone's last. Children visiting their grandparents would light up when they saw him coming, and even the most withdrawn patients would smile when Bear gently nudged their hands with his snout. He was the picture of a perfect therapy animal, gentle, predictable, and beloved by everyone who met him, until that Tuesday afternoon in October when everything changed forever. Emily Hayes, a 26-year-old registered nurse fresh out of a grueling internship, was making her usual rounds with Bear. Emily had been working at Rose Hill for just 3 months, still learning the rhythm of this quiet world where time moved slowly and every small kindness mattered enormously. She loved working with Bear. He had an almost supernatural sense about people, somehow knowing exactly who needed his attention most urgently. They were walking past the West Wing, an older section of the building that housed rooms, 310 through 320. Most of these rooms sat empty, officially labeled as undergoing renovation or being used for storage. The hallway was dimly lit, with outdated wallpaper peeling at the edges and a musty smell that even industrial-strength cleaning products couldn't quite eliminate. Emily rarely ventured down this corridor, but Bear had been restless that day, pulling her in directions he'd never shown interest in before. That's when it happened. Without any warning whatsoever, Bear stopped dead in his tracks. Not a casual pause or momentary distraction, but a complete freeze. His entire body went rigid as stone. His hackles rose in a way Emily had never witnessed before. His ears perked forward at full attention, and his nose began twitching rapidly as he processed scents completely invisible to human senses. Then came the growl, deep, bone-chilling, and utterly primal. It was the growl of a police dog who had detected imminent danger, not the gentle, therapy animal that residents had grown to love and trust. The sound sent ice-cold chills racing down Emily's spine and made her stomach twist with inexplicable dread. "Hey, what's wrong, buddy?" she whispered urgently, crouching beside him and placing a comforting hand on his trembling shoulder. But Bear didn't respond to her voice, didn't even seem to register her presence. His intense, laser-focused gaze was locked onto a single door at the far end of the dimly lit hallway. Room 316. The door was noticeably different from all the others, older and significantly heavier, with a small brass nameplate that had been deliberately and thoroughly scratched beyond any hope of recognition. Someone had taken great care to ensure that whatever name had once been displayed, there would never be readable again. Then Bear did something he had never, not once, done in his 3 months at Rose Hill. He barked. Not the friendly, welcoming yip he used to greet familiar residents, but a sharp, urgent, almost desperate warning that echoed down the empty corridor like a gunshot in a library. The sound was so unexpected, so completely out of character, that it brought a nearby nurse rushing from an adjacent room. "Everything okay down there?" the nurse called out, her voice clearly annoyed by the sudden disruption of the facility's carefully maintained, peaceful atmosphere. Yeah, sorry," Emily replied quickly, tugging gently but insistently on Bear's leash. "Just Bear being weird, I guess." But the nurse's expression darkened noticeably when she realized exactly which door they were standing near. Her entire demeanor shifted from mere annoyance to something approaching alarm. "Don't linger around that room," she said firmly, her voice carrying an unmistakable warning. "It's sealed for a very good reason." Emily nodded obediently and managed to coax Bear away from the mysterious door, but he kept looking back over his shoulder as they walked, his body language still tense and alert, like a soldier who hadn't been dismissed from duty. His ears remained perked, his nose continued twitching, and every few steps he would turn his head to stare back at room 316 with an intensity that made Emily's skin crawl. That night, lying in her small apartment across town, Emily couldn't shake the haunting image of Bear's dramatic reaction. She'd worked with animals before during her training, and she knew that dogs possessed senses far superior to humans. They could detect gas leaks, predict medical emergencies, even sense changes in atmospheric pressure before storms arrived. But this felt fundamentally different from any of those natural phenomena. Bear hadn't been detecting environmental danger. He had been detecting something morally wrong. Emily tried desperately to rationalize what she'd witnessed. Old buildings made strange noises all the time. Mice scurried behind walls. Maybe maintenance had left some kind of equipment running behind that door, creating sounds or odors that triggered Bear's deeply ingrained police training. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself, these logical explanations felt hollow and inadequate. Bear was too well-trained, too experienced, too professional to react so dramatically to something mundane and harmless. 2 nights later, Emily was working the overnight shift, and the retirement home felt like a completely different world after dark. Hallways that bustled with activity during daylight hours became eerily quiet, broken only by the soft mechanical hum of air conditioning systems and the occasional electronic beeps from medical monitors in the East Wing, where the most fragile residents slept under careful observation. Emily had always found the night shift peaceful and rewarding, offering chances to catch up on paperwork and spend quiet, meaningful moments with patients who couldn't sleep. But Bear was acting strangely again from the moment they'd entered the building. Instead of his usual routine of methodically greeting regular patients and settling down for long, comfortable naps, he kept pulling insistently toward the West Wing. Every single time they passed the entrance to that older corridor, Bear would stop completely and stare down the darkened hallway, with his ears perked at maximum attention and his body coiled with tension. Emily tried to dismiss his behavior, but her curiosity was growing stronger than her caution with each passing hour. Just after 1:30 a.m., when the building had settled into its deepest, most profound quiet, Emily made a decision that would change her life forever. She decided to walk Bear through the West Wing one final time before ending her shift, telling herself she just wanted to put his increasingly agitated behavior to rest once and for all. The moment they turned into that corridor, Bear's entire demeanor transformed completely. He walked with focused intensity that Emily had only heard described by his former police handlers, moving with the methodical precision of a working dog on active duty. When they reached room 316, he didn't just stop casually. He planted himself directly in front of the door like a sentinel and began barking with increasing urgency. 3 sharp staccato bursts, followed by a pause, then one long, mournful howl that seemed to echo endlessly through the empty hallway. The sound raised goosebumps along Emily's arms and made her heart pound with inexplicable fear. "Stop it, Bear," Emily whispered urgently, kneeling beside him and placing both hands on his trembling shoulders. You're going to wake up everybody in the building." But Bear wouldn't stop his desperate barking. If anything, his vocalizations became more insistent, more frantic, as if he was trying to communicate something critically important that she wasn't understanding. That's when Emily noticed something that made her heart skip several beats. Light. The faintest possible glow was seeping out from the crack beneath the mysterious door. Her mind raced with impossible questions. This couldn't be right. According to every record she'd ever seen, no patients were assigned to the West Wing. No staff members were scheduled to work anywhere past room 310. The entire section was supposedly empty, abandoned, forgotten. Yet there was unmistakably light coming from inside room 316. Faint, but definitely present. Flickering irregularly like a lamp left burning or a television set tuned to static. Emily's hands trembled violently as she reached for the door handle, but it was locked tight. Of course it was locked. She knelt down carefully and peered through the old-fashioned keyhole, half expecting to see nothing but darkness and dust. What she saw instead sent her reeling backward in absolute shock and terror. A shadow was moving across the room with slow, dragging movements that suggested something heavy being pulled or repositioned with great difficulty. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but hunched and distorted like someone who had been systematically broken and never allowed to heal properly. Bear snarled viciously, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. Every muscle in his powerful body coiled for immediate action. Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing frantically as she tried to process what she'd just witnessed. Someone was definitely in that room. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist according to every official record, hidden away in a wing that was supposed to be completely abandoned. She grabbed Bear's leash with shaking hands and hurried away as quickly as possible, but she could feel his profound reluctance in every reluctant step. He kept looking back and whining softly, as if he knew they were abandoning something critically important. The next morning, Emily found it impossible to concentrate on her regular duties. She kept making casual inquiries, carefully fishing for information without seeming suspicious or overly interested. "Hey, do we ever use the West Wing for storage or anything like that?" she asked Mrs. Langley, the experienced day supervisor. The older woman's face tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that lasted barely a second. "Best to stay where you're assigned, sweetheart," she replied with a smile that absolutely didn't reach her eyes. "I thought I saw a light on in one of those rooms last night," Emily pressed gently, watching Mrs. Langley's reaction carefully. "Old wiring," the supervisor said dismissively, but Emily caught the slight tremor in her voice. Nothing to worry about at all. But Emily was definitely worried now. She started taking detailed notes, documenting everything she could remember about Bear's behavior and what she'd witnessed. More importantly, she began systematically digging into the facility's computerized records during her downtime, searching for any information about the mysterious West Wing. Every single room from 311 to 320 was officially listed as either vacant or under renovation in the main database. But when Emily accessed the electronic medication delivery logs through her nursing credentials, she discovered something that made her blood run cold with horror. 3 separate pharmaceutical deliveries had been made to the West Wing in just the past month. No patient names were attached to these orders. No identification numbers, no intake files, no insurance information, just blank spaces in the computer system where human beings should have been recorded. Someone, or possibly multiple people, were receiving medication in that allegedly empty wing, people who didn't officially exist anywhere in Rose Hill's comprehensive record-keeping systems. Over the following several days, Emily's informal investigation deepened considerably. She began arriving early for her shifts, staying late after clocking out, and carefully observing patterns she'd never bothered to notice before. She saw maintenance workers carrying supplies toward the West Wing who somehow never emerged from the main east entrance. She noticed that certain staff members possessed access cards that worked on doors others couldn't open. Most disturbing of all, she observed that Bear's agitation wasn't limited to room 316 anymore. He'd become hypervigilant throughout the entire facility, his head constantly swiveling to track movement, his nose twitching almost continuously as if he was simultaneously tracking multiple suspicious scents that absolutely didn't belong in a legitimate healthcare facility. One evening, as Emily was walking Bear past the maintenance area, something extraordinary and revealing happened. A worker pushing a cart loaded with tools was passing nearby when Bear suddenly lunged forward with lightning speed, not to attack anyone, but to grab something very specific. Before Emily could react or intervene, Bear had expertly yanked a complete set of keys from the man's belt and was backing away with them, clenched securely in his teeth. "Hey!" the startled worker shouted, reaching futilely for his missing keys. But Bear was already out of range, his police training evident in his tactical movements. "Sorry, I don't know what got into him," Emily apologized profusely, quickly kneeling beside Bear and gently coaxing him to release the stolen keys. "He's never done anything like this before." As she handed the keyring back to the frustrated maintenance worker, Emily caught a crucial glimpse of one particular key that made her heart race. It was noticeably older and more worn than all the others, with a small, rusted label that she could just barely make out. The faded marking read 316. Emily's mind exploded with questions she was afraid to ask out loud. Why would a maintenance worker be carrying a key to a room that was supposedly sealed permanently and forgotten entirely? Why was it the only key on the entire ring with a specific room number clearly marked? And why had Bear, with his incredible instincts, specifically targeted that particular set of keys? That night, Emily sat in her car for nearly an hour after her shift ended, staring at Rose Hill's darkened windows and trying desperately to make sense of the increasingly disturbing pattern she was uncovering. Bear was curled up peacefully in the passenger seat, but even in sleep his ears twitched responsively at every distant sound, and his legs moved slightly, as if he was dreaming about pursuit or patrol duties. The more time Emily spent with Bear, the more she found herself trusting his highly trained instincts over any official explanation she'd been given by human authorities. Dogs didn't lie or manipulate. They didn't have political motivations or financial incentives to cover up inconvenient truths. If Bear sensed something fundamentally wrong at Rose Hill, then something was definitely catastrophically wrong. By the time her next night shift began, Emily had made a decision that would ultimately save lives and expose corruption at the highest levels. She was going back to room 316, and this time she absolutely wasn't leaving without concrete answers, no matter what the personal cost might be. The West Wing hallway felt significantly colder that night, as if the very air was reluctant to circulate properly through that forgotten corridor. Emily moved slowly and deliberately, using her phone's flashlight as sparingly as possible to avoid attracting unwanted attention from any staff members who might still be awake. Most of the overnight personnel were either sleeping in designated rest areas or stationed exclusively in the East Wing with the medical patients who required constant monitoring. Bear walked beside her with unusual and unmistakable purpose, each step deliberate and nearly silent. When they finally reached room 316, he sat down calmly and waited with infinite patience, as if he had always known that this confrontation was inevitable and had simply been waiting for Emily to reach the same conclusion. Emily's hands shook uncontrollably as she tried the maintenance worker's stolen key in the ancient lock, half expecting it not to fit properly. But the key turned smoothly and silently, and the heavy door opened with barely a whisper of sound. The moment it cracked open, Emily was hit by a complex mixture of odors that made her stomach lurch with nausea. Stale air mixed with the sharp antiseptic smell of medical equipment and something else, something organic and deeply unpleasant that even the strongest cleaning products couldn't quite mask or eliminate. Emily stepped carefully inside, her phone's flashlight revealing a scene that completely defied everything she thought she knew about Rose Hill Retirement Home. This wasn't just a storage room or abandoned patient quarters, as she'd been led to believe. The space was significantly larger than she'd expected, clearly modified extensively from its original residential layout. Two narrow hospital beds dominated the center of the room, both equipped with sheets that showed obvious signs of recent use. Fresh indentations in the mattresses, wrinkled pillowcases, personal belongings scattered on nearby surfaces. An IV stand rested against the far wall, with fresh medical tubing coiled around its base and medication bags hanging from its hooks. A television mounted high in the corner flickered constantly with static, providing the mysterious light she'd seen seeping under the door during her previous visits. But it was the figure slumped in the wheelchair that made Emily's breath catch painfully in her throat. An elderly man sat facing the far wall, motionless except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of his labored breathing. His appearance was absolutely shocking and heartbreaking. Gaunt, hollow features, deeply sunken eyes, hair that looked as if it had been roughly and carelessly cut with dull scissors. He looked like someone who had been systematically forgotten by the entire world, left to exist in this hidden space, while life continued normally just yards away. "Sir?" Emily called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stirred slightly, but didn't turn around to acknowledge her presence. Instead, he raised one trembling skeletal hand and pointed with obvious effort toward a nightstand beside the nearest hospital bed. Emily approached carefully, Bear staying close behind her like a protective shadow, and opened the drawer with extreme caution. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn, completely smoothed by countless desperate hands. The binding was cracked and failing, and several pages appeared to be missing entirely. Emily picked it up gently, as if it might disintegrate at her touch. The man finally spoke, his voice barely audible and dry, from obvious disuse. Each word seemed to require tremendous effort. "He thinks no one remembers us anymore." "Who are you?" Emily asked, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid he might hear it. The man turned his wheelchair slightly, just enough for Emily to see his face in profile. Despite his obviously frail and deteriorated physical condition, there was something unmistakably alert and intelligent burning in his eyes, a spark of humanity that hadn't been completely extinguished, despite whatever horrors he'd endured. "You already know," he said with certainty that chilled Emily to her bones. Emily didn't know, but something about his tone and the way he looked at her suggested that she should, that somewhere in her, subconscious, she'd already begun to understand the magnitude of what she'd stumbled into. She opened the notebook carefully to the first page, and the words she read there changed everything she thought she understood about Rose Hill, about healthcare, and about human nature itself. They were supposed to be dead. Page after page contained handwritten entries, some in the same shaky script as the first entry, others in completely different handwriting that suggested multiple authors over an extended period of time. Names, dates, detailed medical procedures, and pharmaceutical trials were documented with meticulous, obsessive precision. But it was a phrase that appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook that made Emily's blood freeze in her veins. Subject termination postponed, moved to holding. These weren't legitimate medical records of any kind, she recognized. They were evidence of something far more sinister and systematic than she'd ever imagined possible. As Emily flipped through page after page of increasingly disturbing documentation, she began to understand that she wasn't looking at records for a single forgotten patient. She was examining evidence of multiple people who had been deliberately and systematically erased from all official records, hidden away in this secret wing, and subjected to medical treatments that served no legitimate therapeutic purpose whatsoever. The man in the wheelchair watched her read with an expression that combined hope and resignation in equal measure. "My name is Gerald Brooks," he said finally, his voice gaining slightly more strength. "At least I think that's still my real name. Sometimes it becomes very difficult to remember what's actually real and what they've made us believe through their treatments." Emily closed the notebook carefully, her mind racing frantically as she tried to process the implications of what she'd discovered. "Gerald, how long have you been hidden away in this room?" He laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in the sound, only bitterness and despair. "Time works very differently when you're officially supposed to be dead. It could be months since they brought me here, could be years. They bring the medicines regularly. They ask their questions, they turn on their machines and conduct their experiments. Then they leave us completely alone until the next scheduled session." "What machines?" Emily asked, though she was beginning to dread the answer. Gerald pointed with obvious effort toward the wall behind Emily. She turned and saw something she'd completely missed in her initial shock at finding him. A door. Not a regular residential door, but a heavy, institutional metal barrier with sophisticated electronic locks, and what appeared to be a biometric scanner mounted beside it like something from a science fiction movie. "That's where they keep the others," Gerald said quietly, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Emily stared at the high-tech scanner, her mind struggling desperately to process what she was seeing. This wasn't just about one forgotten patient hidden in a secret room. This was evidence of a systematic, technologically sophisticated operation that required advanced equipment, careful coordination, and significant financial resources. The retirement home she thought she knew, with its gentle staff and peaceful atmosphere, was serving as an elaborate front for something much darker and more sinister than she'd ever imagined possible. "How many others are being held behind that door?" Emily whispered. Gerald's eyes grew distant and unfocused. "I stopped counting after they brought in the young woman. She couldn't have been more than 30 years old. They called her Subject 13, said she was special, that her brain reacted differently to their experimental treatments. They've kept her longer than any of the others, put her through more sessions than anyone should have to endure." Emily felt physically sick. A 30-year-old woman hidden away and subjected to illegal medical experiments by people who viewed her as nothing more than a test subject. Is she still alive? Is she still being held behind that door? "Last I knew, yes," Gerald confirmed grimly. "But I don't know for how much longer. They've been talking about implementing final protocols recently. In my experience, that usually means someone's time is running out very quickly." Emily made a split-second decision that would haunt her for weeks to come. She had to see what was behind that metal door, regardless of the personal risks involved. She approached the biometric scanner, knowing logically that it was futile, but needing to try anyway. To her complete amazement, when she pressed her thumb to the electronic reader, it beeped softly, and the lock disengaged with a quiet mechanical click. "How is that even possible?" Emily breathed, staring at the scanner in disbelief. Gerald managed a sad, bitter smile. "They programmed it for all the nursing staff years ago, back when they thought this entire operation would be temporary and they'd need regular access. They never bothered updating the security system when staff changed or people left. Institutional laziness, you might say." The door opened to reveal a corridor that looked absolutely nothing like the rest of Rose Hill. The walls were painted institutional white, sterile and cold. The floors were polished concrete that reflected the harsh fluorescent, lights humming overhead. It felt more like a medical research facility or military installation than any part of a retirement home. Emily walked forward slowly, Bear staying close at her side, until she reached another door, marked only with the number 317. This room was smaller than Gerald's quarters, starker and infinitely more disturbing in its clinical coldness. A single hospital bed dominated the space, surrounded by sophisticated monitoring equipment that beeped and whirred with electronic precision. Multiple IV lines snaked across the floor. Computers displayed complex readouts that Emily didn't recognize. Strapped to the bed with thick leather restraints at her ankles and wrists was a young woman, pale and frighteningly thin, with her head completely shaved and multiple electrodes attached to her temples with medical tape. The woman was awake, staring directly at the ceiling with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing simultaneously, as if her mind had retreated. somewhere far from her physical body, to escape whatever had been done to her. Emily rushed to the bedside, quickly checking the restraints and examining the various tubes and wires connected to the woman's body. "Hey, can you hear me?" she whispered urgently, placing a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "My name is Emily. I'm a nurse here at Rose Hill." The woman's mouth moved slightly, but no sound emerged at first. Emily leaned closer, straining to hear any response. Finally, she caught a whisper, so soft she had to practically press her ear to the woman's lips to understand it. Subject 13. Emily's heart broke completely. This human being, this young woman who had once had a name, a life, people who loved her, had been systematically reduced to nothing more than a number in someone's twisted experiment. "What's your real name?" Emily asked gently, fighting back tears. "What did people call you before they brought you here?" The woman's eyes focused on Emily's face for the first time, as if seeing another human being treating her with basic dignity was a shock to her system. I don't remember," she said, her voice gaining slightly more strength but still barely audible. "They took it away from me. They took everything away." Emily began working carefully on the leather restraints, trying to restore some circulation to the woman's arms and legs without making it obvious that someone had been tampering with them. But Bear suddenly barked sharply, a warning that made Emily freeze completely. Footsteps echoed from the corridor outside, accompanied by voices speaking in low, professional tones. Someone was coming, and they would be there in seconds. "Hide!" Gerald's voice called urgently from the adjacent room. "They're making their scheduled rounds." Emily looked around desperately, spotting a supply closet in the corner of the room that appeared just wide enough to accommodate her and Bear. She squeezed inside with him, pulling the door almost completely closed, but leaving it cracked just enough to see and hear what happened next. Two people entered wearing standard medical scrubs, but they moved nothing like typical healthcare workers. Their movements were mechanical, efficient, completely devoid of the compassion and warmth that Emily had been trained to show all patients. They approached Subject 13's bed like technicians servicing a piece of equipment rather than people caring for a human being. "Vitals are holding steady," one of them reported in a flat, emotionless tone that made Emily's skin crawl. "Neural suppression is maintaining at 70% effectiveness." "Excellent," the other replied with equal coldness. "Dr. Quaid wants her prepared for the final experimental session tomorrow night. After that, we can proceed with standard disposal protocols according to the established timeline." Emily's blood turned to ice in her veins. Disposal protocols. These people were discussing murdering this young woman, and they talked about it with the same casual indifference they might use to discuss taking out the trash. The two fake medical workers completed their checks efficiently and left as mechanically as they'd arrived. Emily emerged from the supply closet with her mind racing frantically. She had maybe 18 hours before they killed Subject 13, 18 hours to figure out how to save her, expose what was happening at Rose Hill, and somehow stay alive long enough to see justice done. She knelt beside the woman's bed, working quickly to loosen the restraints just enough to restore proper blood circulation without making the tampering obvious to anyone who might check. "I'm going to get you out of here," Emily promised with fierce determination. "Just hold on until tomorrow night. Can you do that for me?" The woman gripped Emily's hand with surprising strength, her eyes more alert than they'd been since Emily first found her. "Don't let them erase me completely," she whispered, desperately. "Please, I want to remember who I used to be." Emily squeezed back reassuringly. "You will remember. I promise you that. We're going to get your life back." That night, Emily didn't go home to her apartment. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything except the woman strapped to that bed and the words "disposal protocols" echoing endlessly in her mind. She spent the early morning hours desperately researching everything she could find about Rose Hill's ownership. Structure, licensing agreements, and financial backing. What she discovered was a complex web of shell companies, defense contractors, and pharmaceutical research firms that painted a picture far more sinister and extensive than simple elder abuse or insurance fraud. Rose Hill wasn't just a retirement home that had somehow gone bad or become corrupted over time. It was a carefully constructed front for illegal human experimentation, specifically designed to use society's most vulnerable and forgotten people as test subjects for treatments that would never be approved through any legitimate medical channels. The name that appeared most frequently throughout her research was Dr. Ellis Quaid, a neuroscientist who had previously worked for the Department of Defense before mysteriously disappearing from all public records in 2012. His published research had focused on memory suppression and behavioral modification, technologies with obvious military and intelligence applications, but devastating consequences for the human test subjects required to develop them. Emily printed everything she could find and carefully organized the documents into a manila envelope that she hoped would someday serve as evidence in a criminal prosecution. Then she called her friend Caleb, who worked in healthcare compliance and regulatory oversight. "I need to ask you something hypothetical," she said when he answered his phone, trying to keep her voice steady despite her exhaustion and fear. "If someone discovered patients being held illegally at a care facility, subjected to unauthorized medical experiments, what would happen to the people responsible?" Caleb's voice immediately became serious and professional. "Emily, what's going on? Why are you asking about this? Just answer the question, please. If we're talking about unlicensed detention and medical experimentation on human subjects, that's serious federal crime territory. FBI involvement, DEA, possibly even military. Investigation depending on who's providing funding or oversight. This kind of thing could bring down entire networks of people. Why are you asking me this?" Emily took a deep breath, knowing that once she spoke her next words, there would be no going back to her quiet life as a regular nurse. "Because I found something at Rose Hill, and I think people are going to die very soon if I don't act immediately." That evening, Emily returned to Rose Hill with a plan that was equal parts desperate and dangerous. She'd convinced herself that the only way to save Subject 13 was to document absolutely everything, gather irrefutable evidence that couldn't be dismissed or covered up, and then extract the woman before the so-called disposal protocols could be implemented. She brought Bear, a digital camera, a voice recorder, and the maintenance key that had started this entire investigation. Her hands were steady as she unlocked room 316, but her heart was pounding hard enough that she worried Gerald might hear it from across the room. The elderly man was exactly where she'd left him, but he seemed more alert and focused tonight, as if he'd been waiting for her inevitable return and preparing himself for whatever came next. "They moved up the timeline," he said without any preamble, getting straight to the most critical information. "They're coming for her in less than 2 hours, not tomorrow night like they originally planned." Emily felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Completely. What changed? Why are they moving so quickly? Gerald pointed shakily to a small security monitor she hadn't noticed before, mounted high in the corner where the wall met the ceiling. "Someone's been reviewing the surveillance footage from the past few days. They know you were here. They know you've seen things you weren't supposed to see." Emily stared at the camera with growing horror, realizing that her investigation had been completely compromised from the very beginning. Whoever was running this illegal operation had been watching her movements, evaluating whether she posed a threat to their activities, and apparently deciding that she definitely did. "We have to get her out right now," Emily said firmly, moving toward the metal door that led to the hidden rooms. "They'll kill all 3 of us if we try," Gerald warned grimly. "These people don't leave loose ends." Emily turned back to face him directly. "They're going to kill her anyway, and probably you too. Once they decide you're too much of a liability. At least this way, she has a fighting chance." Gerald studied her face intently for a long moment, then nodded slowly with obvious resolve. The biometric scanner will work for maybe another hour before they reset all the access codes. After that, we'll be permanently locked out. Emily didn't waste any more precious time on discussion or planning. She and Bear moved quickly through the hidden corridor to room 317, where Subject 13 was awake, and alert, as if she somehow sensed that something critically important was about to happen. "I'm getting you out of here right now," Emily said decisively, working as quickly as possible on the leather restraints. "Can you walk at all?" "I think so," the woman replied, her voice noticeably stronger than it had been during Emily's previous visit. "But they'll come after us. They'll never stop hunting us." "Let them try," Emily said grimly, helping the woman sit up slowly and then stand on unsteady legs. "Bear here is a retired police dog. He's handled much worse than a bunch of fake doctors playing with people's lives." As if responding directly to his name being mentioned, Bear positioned himself strategically by the door, every sense alert for approaching danger, ready to defend the people he'd sworn to protect. That's when the alarms started wailing throughout the entire facility. Not fire alarms or medical emergency signals that Emily was familiar with, but security alarms she'd never heard before in her months at Rose Hill. Red warning lights flashed along the ceiling, and a low, pulsing siren echoed through the hidden corridor like something from a military installation. Someone had discovered their escape attempt, and the entire building was now in lockdown mode. "Move now!" Emily shouted, half carrying Subject 13 toward the exit, while Gerald wheeled himself toward the main door as fast as his weakened condition would allow. But when they reached the Wing's main hallway, their escape route was completely blocked. 3 men in black tactical uniforms stood waiting with professional military precision, their faces hidden behind masks, but their body language radiating lethal competence. They weren't carrying firearms, but Emily could clearly see tasers and restraints clipped to their equipment belts. "Nobody moves another step," the apparent leader commanded, in a voice that brooked no argument whatsoever. "Step away from the test subject." Immediately, Bear didn't hesitate for even a fraction of a second. With a snarl of pure fury that Emily had never heard from him before, he launched himself at the nearest tactical operative, not to kill, but to disable and disarm. His powerful jaws clamped down on the man's wrist with bone-crushing force, causing him to cry out in pain and drop his taser to clatter uselessly across the floor. The distraction was exactly what Emily desperately needed. She yanked the fire alarm handle on the wall, triggering sprinkler systems throughout the entire facility and sending the building's security protocols into complete chaos. Emergency lights began flashing, water cascaded from the ceiling, soaking everyone, and somewhere in the distance, Emily could hear elderly residents calling out in confusion and alarm as their peaceful night was shattered. In the resulting pandemonium, Gerald grabbed Emily's arm with surprising strength and pointed toward a door she'd never noticed before in all her months working at Rose Hill. "Service exit!" he shouted over the deafening noise of alarms and sprinklers. "Leads directly to the underground parking garage." They ran or moved as quickly as Subject 13's severely weakened condition would allow, with Bear serving as their rear guard. Behind them, Emily could hear shouting voices and heavy footsteps, but the sprinkler system and emergency protocols had thrown the facility into enough confusion to give them a crucial head start in their desperate escape. The service door opened onto a dimly lit parking garage beneath the main building that Emily had never known existed. Her personal car was parked on the surface level, but Gerald directed them to a maintenance elevator that would take them up, without having to navigate through the main lobby where additional security might be waiting. As the elevator doors slowly closed behind them, Emily finally allowed herself a moment to breathe deeply. Subject 13 was leaning heavily against the wall, exhausted but genuinely free for the first time in months, or possibly years. Gerald sat in his wheelchair with an expression of complete amazement, as if he couldn't quite believe they'd actually made it this far without being captured or killed. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Emily pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed Caleb's number. When he answered on the second ring, she didn't waste precious time on pleasantries or explanations. "I need federal protection for 3 people, including myself," she said urgently, "and I need it tonight. This can't wait until morning." The safe house turned out to be a nondescript apartment complex about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place where no one asked intrusive questions and everyone minded their own business religiously. Caleb had worked through his contacts in federal law enforcement to arrange temporary protective custody, while investigators sorted out jurisdictional issues and assembled a proper task force to handle what was clearly a major federal crime. Subject 13 slept for nearly 18 straight hours, her traumatized body finally able to rest properly without the constant medical interventions she'd endured for so long. When she finally woke up, the first thing she asked for wasn't food or water or even basic medical attention. She wanted a mirror. "I want to see what they did to me," she said quietly but firmly. Emily brought her a hand mirror from the bathroom, watching carefully as the woman stared at her reflection for several long minutes. She touched her completely shaved head gently, traced the small scars where electrodes had been attached repeatedly to her temples, and examined the needle marks on her arms from countless IV insertions. "I remember having long hair," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "Brown hair that I used to wear in a ponytail. And I think my name started with a J sound." "June?" Emily suggested gently, hoping to trigger more memories. The woman shook her head slowly. "No, that's not quite right, but it feels close somehow." Over the following several days, as federal investigators began the enormously complex process of unraveling the Rose Hill conspiracy, more fragmented memories began surfacing from the depths of Subject 13's systematically suppressed consciousness. She remembered pieces of a life that had existed before her imprisonment, working at a small, independent bookstore, living in an apartment filled with plants by every window, having a younger brother who called religiously every Sunday evening to check on her. But the memory that would ultimately break the entire case wide open was simpler and more devastating than any of the others. She remembered her real name. "Anna," she said one morning over breakfast, the word emerging with absolute certainty and conviction. "My name is Anna Morrison. I'm sure of it now." Emily immediately called the federal investigators with this crucial information, and within hours they had confirmed Anna's identity through missing person reports and dental records. She had disappeared 14 months earlier while hiking alone in a state park about 2 hours from Rose Hill. Her family had never stopped searching for her, never given up hope that she might someday be found alive. The eventual reunion was emotional, but complicated in ways that broke Emily's heart. Anna's memories remained fragmented, some possibly suppressed permanently by the experimental treatment she'd endured. But she was alive, she was free, and she was gradually reclaiming the identity that Dr. Quaid and his team had tried so systematically to erase. Gerald's story proved even more complex and heartbreaking when investigators finally pieced it together. His real name was Gerald Brooks, exactly as he'd told Emily, and he'd been a homeless military veteran struggling with severe PTSD when he was approached by what he'd believed was a legitimate medical outreach program. They'd promised him stable housing, comprehensive health care, and innovative treatment for his combat trauma. Instead, they'd used him as a human test subject for experimental therapies designed to suppress traumatic memories. "The worst part," he told Emily during one of their conversations, "wasn't what they did to my body with their drugs and machines. It was how they made me doubt my own mind completely. They'd show me photographs of my military service, my family, my entire life before they found me, and then use their equipment to make me forget everything over and over again. They did this repeatedly until I couldn't tell anymore what was real and what they'd implanted in my head." The federal investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence emerged from Rose Hill and from Anna's recovered memories. Rose Hill wasn't the only facility involved in this systematic program of illegal human experimentation. Dr. Ellis Quaid had established an entire network of fake care centers across multiple states, all serving as fronts for his research into memory suppression and behavioral modification. The technologies he'd developed had obvious applications for military and intelligence agencies, which explained the defense contractor funding that had kept the program operational for years without detection. But the human cost was absolutely staggering. Investigators eventually identified more than 30 victims, ranging from homeless veterans like Gerald to elderly patients with dementia to young adults like Anna, who had simply disappeared without a trace. Emily testified before a federal grand jury, presenting all the evidence she'd gathered and describing in detail what she'd witnessed in the hidden rooms of Rose Hill. Bear, officially recognized as a key witness in the case, was honored by the FBI for his crucial role in exposing the conspiracy and saving multiple lives. But Dr. Ellis Quaid himself remained frustratingly elusive. By the time federal agents executed coordinated raids on Rose Hill and the other facilities in his network, he had vanished completely without a trace. Some investigators believed he'd fled the country with help from foreign intelligence services. Others suspected he'd been eliminated by the same people who had funded his research, now desperately eager to erase any connections to the illegal program. Emily returned to nursing after the immediate crisis was resolved, but she deliberately chose a completely different kind of facility, a legitimate veterans hospital, where she could help people heal properly rather than participate in hiding their suffering. Bear came with her, officially registered as a therapy animal, but unofficially recognized by everyone as a hero who had saved countless lives through his unwillingness to ignore what others wanted desperately to forget. Anna slowly and painfully rebuilt her life with extensive help from trauma counselors and the unwavering support of her family. She never fully recovered all of her stolen memories, but she regained enough of her essential self to move forward with purpose. She became a passionate advocate for missing persons and victims of medical experimentation, using her own horrific experience to help other people who had been forgotten by society. Gerald chose to remain in the safe house apartment, at least temporarily. After years of having his identity systematically manipulated and his memories deliberately suppressed, he needed significant time to rediscover who he really was, beneath all the psychological damage. Emily visited him regularly, and he always asked specifically about Bear, whose barking in that quiet hallway had ultimately saved his life and restored his freedom. The legal proceedings continued for many months, involving multiple federal agencies working together to untangle the conspiracy and bring the remaining perpetrators to justice. Several staff members from Rose Hill were arrested and convicted, though most claimed they had genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate medical research approved by proper authorities. The true scope of Dr. Quaid's illegal program may never be fully known or understood. How many other facilities had existed? How many victims never made it out alive? How many families continued searching desperately for loved ones who had been systematically erased from existence by people who saw them as nothing more than expendable test subjects for profitable research? What Emily knew for certain was that none of it would ever have been exposed without Bear's extraordinary instincts and unwavering courage. A retired police dog, supposedly enjoying his peaceful golden years in comfortable retirement, had absolutely refused to ignore the scent of injustice and human suffering. His growl in that quiet hallway had been the first crack in a wall of silence that had protected this conspiracy for years. 6 months after the Rose Hill raid made national headlines, Emily received a phone call that changed her understanding of the case once again and revealed just how much larger this conspiracy actually was. The caller identified himself as Agent Martinez from a federal task force investigating defense contractor fraud and illegal human experimentation. "We've been tracking financial records related to the Quaid program for months now," he explained in a weary voice. "We've found evidence that it was much larger and more extensive than anyone initially realized." Emily's heart sank as she processed this information. "How much larger are we talking about?" "We've identified at least 12 separate facilities across 6 different states, all operating under different names and corporate structures, but with the same basic methodology. Retirement homes, veterans centers, mental health facilities, even some homeless shelters, all serving as carefully constructed fronts for illegal human experimentation funded by government contracts. The scope was absolutely staggering and horrifying. Emily had thought Rose Hill was an isolated case, a single rogue facility that had somehow escaped proper oversight and accountability. Instead, it was revealed to be part of a systematic program that had been operating for nearly a decade, funded by taxpayer dollars and private investment from pharmaceutical companies eager to develop treatments they couldn't test through legitimate regulatory channels. "We need your help," Agent Martinez continued. "You're the only person who has direct experience with their methods and survived to document everything properly. We want you to consult on identifying other facilities that might still be operating." Emily agreed without hesitation, but she had one non-negotiable condition. "Bear comes with me everywhere," she said firmly. "He's the one who detected what everyone else missed completely. If there are more facilities out there still, harming people, he'll find them." And he did exactly that. Over the following year, Emily and Bear traveled to suspected locations across the country, using his extraordinary senses and her investigative skills to identify hidden rooms, secret patients, and evidence of ongoing illegal medical procedures. In Arizona, they discovered a veterans center where elderly former servicemen were being used as test subjects for experimental PTSD treatments. In Florida, a mental health facility was systematically using homeless patients to test drugs designed to suppress memory formation. In Oregon, a retirement community had hidden rooms where elderly residents with dementia were subjected to procedures that left them in permanent vegetative states. Each discovery represented a new horror, but also a victory for the victims who had been written off as completely disposable by people who valued scientific advancement over basic human dignity. Bear's incredible nose led investigators to evidence that would have taken months or years to uncover through traditional investigative methods. The final breakthrough in the case came when they visited a facility in Nevada that appeared completely legitimate on the surface. Unlike Rose Hill, this place had spotless inspection records, satisfied families, and absolutely no obvious red flags that would attract regulatory attention. But Bear's behavior changed dramatically the moment they entered the building. He didn't bark or growl this time like he had at Rose Hill. Instead, he began a systematic search pattern Emily had never seen before, moving through the facility with methodical precision as if he was tracking multiple distinct scents simultaneously. He led them to what appeared to be an ordinary supply closet, but when investigators examined it more closely with proper equipment, they found a sophisticated hidden electronic lock. Behind that carefully concealed door was Dr. Ellis Quaid's personal office, complete with files documenting every aspect of his illegal program. Financial records, detailed medical protocols, victim profiles, and extensive correspondence with government officials who had known about and explicitly approved the research. Quaid himself was long gone, but the evidence in his abandoned office was comprehensive enough to bring down the entire network of conspirators. Computer files contained detailed records of every facility, every victim, and every government official who had provided funding or protection for the program over the years. The most shocking discovery was a video recording Quaid had made for what appeared to be a progress report to his government handlers. In it, he calmly and methodically discussed the program's ultimate goals, developing reliable techniques for memory suppression and behavioral modification that could be used on prisoners of war, political dissidents, or anyone else the government deemed a threat to national security. "The beauty of our approach," Quaid said in the recording with chilling clinical detachment, "is that the test subjects themselves become completely complicit in their own systematic erasure. They begin to doubt their own memories, their own sense of identity and personal history. Eventually, they stop resisting our procedures entirely because they're no longer sure who they were before we began working on them." Emily watched the video with a mixture of rage and revulsion that threatened to overwhelm her. These weren't scientists pushing the boundaries of medical knowledge for the betterment of humanity. These were systematic monsters who had deliberately dehumanized vulnerable people for the sake of developing tools of oppression and control. But Quaid had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had underestimated the power of human connection and the unwillingness of some people to ignore suffering, even when it would be much easier and safer to look the other way. He had counted on the complete isolation of his victims, their separation from anyone who might care enough to investigate their disappearance. He hadn't counted on Bear, a retired police dog supposedly living out his peaceful golden years in comfortable retirement, had absolutely refused to walk past that locked door without investigating what lay behind it. His instinctive growl had started a chain of events that exposed a conspiracy years in the making and ultimately saved dozens of innocent lives. More importantly, his example had inspired Emily to risk everything for people she didn't even know, simply because it was the right thing to do regardless of personal cost. The final chapter of the Rose Hill conspiracy came exactly 2 years after Emily first heard Bear bark in that quiet hallway. Dr. Ellis Quaid was finally found living under an assumed identity in a fortified compound in rural Montana, protected by private security and still conducting illegal research on unwilling subjects he'd acquired through a network of human traffickers. Federal agents surrounded the compound at dawn, with Emily and Bear waiting in a command vehicle parked just outside the operational perimeter. They weren't part of the tactical team, but Agent Martinez had insisted they be present for Quaid's final capture. "That dog started this entire investigation," he said with genuine respect. "He deserves to see how it ends." The raid was swift and decisive. Quaid surrendered without resistance, perhaps finally understanding that his years of hiding were over and there was nowhere left to run. As agents led him toward a waiting vehicle in restraints, he caught sight of Emily and Bear watching from the command post. For a long moment, the scientist who had destroyed so many lives stared directly at the retired police dog who had brought down his entire criminal empire. Bear stared back calmly and with dignity, showing no reaction whatsoever to the man whose work had caused immeasurable suffering to innocent people. Then Quaid was gone, loaded into a vehicle that would transport him to face justice for crimes against humanity that most people could barely comprehend. Emily knelt beside Bear and scratched gently behind his ears. "Good boy," she whispered with infinite love and gratitude. "You did so good." Bear wagged his tail once, then settled down for a well-deserved nap, as if capturing international criminals was just another day's work for a retired police dog who had never really stopped serving and protecting. The trials that followed were complex and lengthy, involving multiple jurisdictions and government agencies that were extremely reluctant to admit their role in funding illegal human experimentation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and public outrage was too intense to ignore or suppress. Dr. Ellis Quaid was ultimately convicted on 47 separate counts of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole. Dozens of His associates received substantial prison sentences, and several high-ranking government officials resigned in disgrace when their connections to the program became public knowledge. More importantly, the victims finally began receiving the help and support they desperately needed and deserved. Anna Morrison worked closely with congressional investigators to establish a comprehensive victim compensation fund and support system specifically for survivors of illegal medical experimentation. Gerald Brooks became a powerful spokesperson for veterans' rights, using his horrific experience to advocate for better protections for homeless and mentally ill former servicemen. Emily continued her work as a consulting investigator with federal agencies, but she also returned to her first love, direct patient care. She established a specialized clinic designed to help survivors of medical trauma, providing both physical care and psychological support for people whose trust in the healthcare system had been systematically shattered by criminals masquerading as doctors. Bear remained her constant companion throughout all of this, officially retired, but still alert to the subtle signs of trouble that only his extraordinary senses could detect. Patients at the clinic found his presence incredibly comforting, perhaps sensing that here was a dog who truly understood what it meant to fight for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. As Bear aged, his movements became slower and his naps longer, but his spirit remained completely undiminished. Children who visited the clinic with their grandparents would sit beside him and listen with wide-eyed amazement as Emily told them stories of the brave police dog who had saved people by refusing to ignore what others wanted to forget. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, Emily would tell them during these storytelling sessions. Sometimes they wear uniforms, sometimes they carry badges, and sometimes they just have 4 legs and a nose that can smell trouble from miles away. But they all share one thing in common: they never give up on people who need help, no matter how difficult or dangerous it might be. Bear would wag his tail during these stories, as if he understood that his legacy wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy or bringing criminals to justice. It was about demonstrating that courage could come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important thing anyone could do was simply refuse to walk past suffering without stopping to investigate and help. The Rose Hill case became a textbook example studied in law schools, medical schools, and ethics programs across the country. Legal scholars examined the institutional corruption and the critical importance of whistleblower protection laws. Medical schools used the case to discuss the ethical boundaries of human experimentation and the sacred trust between healthcare providers and patients. But for Emily, the most important lesson was much simpler and more personal. Trust your instincts, especially when they come from someone who has dedicated their entire life to protecting others. Bear had spent 6 years as a police dog, trained to detect danger and defend innocent people. Those deeply ingrained instincts didn't disappear when he officially retired. They simply found a new and critically important purpose. 3 years after the Rose Hill raid made international headlines, Emily received a call from Agent Martinez with news that brought the entire case full circle. "We found something you absolutely need to see," he said seriously. "Can you and Bear meet me at the Federal Building tomorrow morning?" Emily arrived to find Martinez waiting with a file folder and a small, carefully wrapped package that immediately captured her attention. "We've been going through Quaid's personal effects from the Montana compound," he explained. "Most of it was research notes and experimental equipment, but we found this hidden in his private safe." He opened the file to reveal a surveillance photograph that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. It was a black and white image of her and Bear walking down the Rose Hill hallway on the night they first investigated room 316. Someone had been watching and documenting their every move from the very beginning, but it was what Quaid had written on the back of the photograph that was most chilling and revealing. Primary subject exhibits unusual resistance to standard conditioning and protocols. Recommend immediate termination to prevent program exposure. Emily stared at the words with growing horror, realizing how close she had come to becoming another victim of Quaid's systematic program. If not for Bear's protection, her own quick thinking and sheer luck, she might have disappeared into the same system that had claimed Anna, Gerald, and so many others. "There's something else," Martinez said, sliding the wrapped package across the table. Quaid kept incredibly detailed records of every aspect of his program, including the animals used in his research. "We found this in his personal files." Emily unwrapped the package carefully to find a military medal, similar to those awarded to working dogs for distinguished service. The inscription read, "Canine Bear, badge number 347, 6 years of service. Over 50 successful operations, retired with honor." But someone had added a second inscription below the first. "Hero, Rose Hill investigation, lives saved, immeasurable." Emily felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the full significance of what she was holding. Even Dr. Quaid, in his obsessive record-keeping, had been forced to acknowledge Bear's crucial role in bringing down his entire operation. The dog he had probably hoped to eliminate as a threat had instead become the instrument of his ultimate destruction. That evening, Emily carefully attached the medal to Bear's collar and took him for a walk through the quiet neighborhood where they now lived. It was a peaceful area, with tree-lined streets and children playing safely in front yards, the kind of place where retired heroes could enjoy their golden years in well-deserved tranquility. As they walked, Emily reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. It had started with a simple growl in a quiet hallway, the instinctive reaction of a trained police dog who detected something fundamentally wrong. That single moment had led to one of the largest federal investigations of illegal human experimentation in American history, exposing a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. But more than that, it had demonstrated the extraordinary power of refusing to ignore suffering, even when it would be much easier and safer to look the other way. Emily had risked her career, her safety, and ultimately her life to investigate what Bear had detected. Together, they had given voices to people who had been systematically silenced, and brought justice to victims who had been deliberately forgotten. Bear was slowing down now, his police dog days a distant memory. But as they walked through the peaceful neighborhood, Emily noticed that his head still turned sharply at unusual sounds, his nose still twitched at unfamiliar scents, and his eyes still watched constantly for signs of trouble that others might miss. Some instincts never fade completely. Some sense of duty runs too deep to be dimmed by age or official retirement. Heroes, Emily had learned through this experience, don't stop being heroes just because their formal service is over. They simply find new ways to protect and serve the people around them. When they reached the small park at the end of their street, Emily sat on a bench while Bear settled beside her, his head resting contentedly on her lap. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing and playing, secure in a world that was measurably safer because of a retired police dog who had refused to walk past a locked door without investigating what lay behind it. "Thank you," Emily whispered, scratching gently behind Bear's ears, "for everything you've done, for every life you've saved, for showing all of us what real courage looks like." Bear looked up at her with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of years spent in service to others, then settled back down with a contented sigh. His work was finally complete, but his legacy would continue in every life he had saved, every victim he had helped rescue, and every person who learned from his example that heroes truly do come in all forms. Sometimes they wear badges, sometimes they carry weapons, and sometimes they just have 4 legs, a keen nose, and the unwavering courage to bark when something isn't right. But they all share the same essential quality. They absolutely refuse to give up on people who need help, even when the odds seem impossible, and the easier path would be to look the other way. Bear's story reminds us that heroism isn't always about dramatic rescues or spectacular acts of bravery captured on camera. Sometimes it's about the quiet courage to investigate when others would rather ignore, to speak up when others would rather stay silent, and to keep fighting for justice even when the system seems designed to protect those who prey on the vulnerable. In a world that often feels overwhelmed by corruption and indifference, Bear's example offers genuine hope. It shows us that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, that justice has allies in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important thing any of us can do is trust our instincts and refuse to walk past suffering without stopping to help. Bear lived for 3 more peaceful years after receiving his medal, spending his days at Emily's clinic, bringing comfort to trauma survivors, and his evenings relaxing in the quiet neighborhood they called home. When his time finally came, he passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by all the people whose lives he had touched and protected. Emily buried him in a small cemetery specifically for retired service animals, with a headstone that read simply, Bear K9 347 Hero. He never stopped protecting and serving. Every year on the anniversary of the Rose Hill rescue, survivors gather at his grave to remember the dog who saved their lives by refusing to ignore their suffering. Anna Morrison, now fully recovered and working as a victims' rights advocate, always brings fresh flowers. Gerald Brooks, healthy and housed and reunited with family he thought he'd lost forever, tells new visitors about the night a police dog's instincts exposed a conspiracy that had stolen years of their lives. And Emily, still working with trauma survivors, but now training other healthcare workers to recognize signs of abuse and exploitation, always ends these remembrance gatherings with the same powerful words, heroes are all around us, in forms we might never expect. They remind us that justice depends not on perfect systems or flawless people, but on the willingness of ordinary individuals to act with courage when they encounter injustice. Bear showed us that heroism isn't about size or species or official authority. It's about having the courage to bark when something is wrong, and the determination to keep barking until someone finally listens and takes action. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of Bear's incredible story, that each of us has the potential to be a hero simply by refusing to ignore suffering when we encounter it. We may not have a police dog's training or acute senses, but we all possess the ability to recognize when something isn't right, to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, and to persist in seeking justice even when the path forward seems impossible. Bear's legacy lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over silence. His story reminds us that heroes really do come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the most powerful thing any of us can do is simply refuse to walk past a locked door without wondering who might be trapped behind it, desperately waiting for someone to care enough to investigate. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between humans and the animals who dedicate their lives to protecting us. Bear's story shows us that heroes don't always wear capes or carry badges. Sometimes they have 4 legs, a wet nose, and the unwavering instinct to protect those who cannot protect themselves. If this story moved you, please share it with others who need to be reminded that justice is possible, that corruption can be exposed, and that heroes walk among us every single day. From all of us at Heroes Among Us, thank you for listening, and remember, keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and never walk past suffering without stopping to help. You never know when you might be the hero someone desperately needs.